the most bonkers thing that happened to you, or your work, and your employer still expected you to continue your workday? Story 1. Right after Hurricane Sandy, the bank I worked for had no power for days, so obviously we couldn't do any banking. Rather than just close, my manager insisted that the entire staff show up for shifts as usual, just so we could sit in our normal seats in our uniforms and winter jackets to tell any customers who wandered in that we didn't have power and couldn't help them with anything at all. Just about every single person asked us some variation of them, "What the are you doing here? It sucked." Story 2. I was working at a pet store and was used to being bitten by the pets we sold. Hamsters, ferrets, birds. No big deal this day, however, as I was helping a woman who had brought her dog in, it attacked me. Luckily, it was a smallish, medium-sized dog, so it didn't get my face, but I had big bleeding holes all up and down one arm. The lady never said sorry, and my manager told me to go to the back, get cleaned up, and come back out and ring on the resistor. So I did, with big blood splatters all over my yellow uniform shirt. Story 3. Hurricane Katrina was going to make landfall that day, and the owner of the restaurant I was managing at the time got super pissed when I said I wasn't coming in. He wouldn't accept that and kept bargaining with me. "Okay, you can go in for 4 hours, and I can get other manager to come relieve you, no?" He was like, "Well, go hide your keys then, so we can have someone else pick them up." Absolutely. After the storm hit and devastated New Orleans, the owner was calling me because they needed people to open the restaurant. The roof had blown off of my house, and I was asking him where was I going to live while I worked for him. He said to just get a hotel, as if he was paying me enough to afford such a thing. I also think hotels were pretty well full. Not sure. Story 4. College professor. Not a boss in college. We had our final semester presentations that counted for 60 of our grade. I was on blood thinners at the time, and the night before my presentation, I had an accident in the home and split my head open. 12 hours later, it was still bleeding. First thing I did in the morning was email my professor with an explanation and a time-stamped photo of blood running down my face. I asked if I could present the following day instead, and said that was not possible without a doctor's note. I had to go to the doctor, pay a $32 copay, just so the teacher could write on a note, "Philip's head will not stop bleeding because of medication he is on. I can't believe I had to write you this note." Story 5. I told my employer I was moving across country and that my last day was in 2 weeks. The day came, and they called me as I was on the road asking if I was going to come in. Story 6. Someone spilled or poured out a bottle of deer extractant on the floor under the shelves in the sporting goods section of Walmart. Stank of deer for, well, actually, it probably still does. They never cleaned it, and we had ammo to sell. Story 7. The power went out at 8 but we weren't allowed to go home. We sat around doing nothing for nearly 8 hours, just in case the power came on. Then our boss said if it didn't come on by 4 p.m., we could go home, and the work schedule would be pushed ahead a full day. Power came on at 3:50 p.m., and we had to do our full workload. Story 8. Worked for a small graphic design company fresh out of school. They used cracked software, didn't really pay anyone, and were generally shady, but I didn't really think anything of it until the FBI showed up. Apparently, they also didn't pay their taxes, and so my boss was taken away in handcuffs, and the office was closed, or so I thought. Our boss called our creative director from jail and told us to work from this seedy motel room he set up to finish up the assignment, or else we wouldn't get paid. Nobody showed apparently, as we all decided now would be a good time to look for new opportunities. Story 9. Worked as a cashier at a public swimming pool. Some guy robbed us and took more than $1,000 from my register. Note we were responsible for the money in the register, so while the police sort things out with management and insurance, they expected me to go to the bank, get 1,000 euros of changing money, and come back to work, and in my shift, I quit on spot. Story 10. Snowstorm dumped like 6 inches of snow the day before, and then rained, creating a sheet of ice on the roads. People were literally abandoning their vehicles on the sides of the highway because the driving conditions got so treacherous it was safer to walk. I had just recently gotten an all-wheel drive SUV and was expected to come in that next day, while my coworker who had a 2-wheel drive sedan was allowed to stay at home until the ice melted. I tried explaining that AWD does not automatically mean safe to operate on icy roads. I didn't even have chains yet at the time, but that went over like a lead balloon. Story 11. Automotive painting. Been complaining about my mask parts needing replacing for a few weeks. Finally, my mask broke, and I refused to paint because toxic fumes were coming into my mask. Being the only automotive painter, work came to a halt. I was told to get in there and paint or else. I pointed at the security camera and asked him to say that again, but a little louder. He fired 2 people that day, but I wasn't one of them. Story 12. When it was hours before Hurricane Harvey was going to make landfall, and they were still tentative about releasing us from work so that we would have time to go and board up our homes, stock up on supplies, or evacuate if needed. We were blessed by being allowed to leave 1 hour. Early sarcasm was meant on that last sentence. Story 13, I was working at a hotel on the bar and as a waitress. One day, a couple of hours before my shift, I started feeling really sick. I have stomach issues, but knew it was different. I called and said I was not feeling great. They insisted I come in. My mom had to drive me in because I felt too sick to drive. I worked an hour, got to the point of I'm definitely throwing up, and told them I had to go else I was going to throw up on the customers. They told me that they weren't happy and they better see me tomorrow. I had norovirus, which comes on really quickly, and emailed the next day saying this, and that I wouldn't be coming in until 48 hours has passed. They were generally nasty people to work for, cliquey, rude, stole tips, demanding, and unreasonable. When I told them about a holiday ID, had booked since before they employed me, they asked for my flight number so they could put me on shift 4 hours after it landed, then got pissed when I was late cause my plane got delayed. Story 14, working at McDonald's. I was supposed to do the overnight shift, but I was sick. Couldn't get out of bed and throwing up sick. Called that day hours in advance to say I couldn't make it in. I had been working there quite a few years, so they knew I was competent and would never call in unless necessary. I got written up because they needed me in because the hygiene inspector was coming in the morning. I couldn't believe it. I quit not long after. I had to clarify, I would have still been there when he arrived, looking deathly ill and potentially throwing up most of my shift whilst preparing food for customers. Part of me wished I had, so I could tell him I was forced to work despite my condition, but that wouldn't have been fair on the customers. Story 15, I got a call one day from my cousin saying our house had been broken into. I went home to deal with it and file a police report, and it was honestly so stressful. My supervisor then rang me to ask what time I was planning on coming back to work later in the day, because she had paperwork for me to finish. Story 16 was a welder in a factory. 5 minutes after I got back from lunch, a nice bit of somehow made it under my glove and burnt my wrist. I quickly dropped the welding gun, trying to get the glove off to get the burning metal off. I tried to grab the gun with my other hand so it wouldn't clatter to the floor and possibly break, but I missed the handle and instead grabbed the hose a little under. The tip of the welding gun swung down and the hot wire went straight into my leg. I pulled it out and gimped to my lead, explaining what happened and if I could go treat the wound. The response, "You're behind, you'd better hit your number." I didn't get even a bandage, wasn't recorded, and I still had 6 hours to go. Wasn't the worst pain I've endured, but would not recommend, but now I've got matching scars on my wrist and my leg. Story 17, worked as a busboy for a now-closed restaurant. I came in for my shift one time when they had roofers working on the roof. The section of roof they worked on was all terracotta roof tile, and they needed to remove it all to replace it. The upper management decided it was a great idea to have this work done during the lunch hours and were open for those hours. Little did they all know is there were cracks on the ceiling inside, and while the removal was happening, the terracotta tile, dust was raining inside all over the guests and their food. Management still tried to continue restaurant service as usual, but the guests were having none of it and just walked out. I come to an empty restaurant littered with tile dust, and we were expected to clean it up before dinner started. It took at least a month for my lungs to clean out that, because I was not provided any respiratory gear to clean up that mess. The restaurant in question was Charlie's Crab Palm Beach, owned by the Landry's Corporation. Story 18, I had just started working as an assistant at a daycare, and the teacher in charge of the room got a call saying that her daughter got into a car accident. She immediately left, and the boss put me in charge of the whole classroom for the day, or was supposed to at least. The teacher stayed with her daughter through her recovery, and then took her vacation time. So I was left in charge for nearly 2 months. Worst part was that I still got paid as an assistant. Story 19, I was working in the kitchen at a resort in the Rockies last summer. We had a pretty high grizzly population in the area, so when tourists came to stay at the resort, we had bear spray that they could borrow if they wanted to walk the trails around the resort. There was a new guy who worked at the front desk who was asked to show a couple of guests how to use the spray in case they needed to. So he slid the lock off and accidentally sprayed a big cloud of mace, and basically everyone who was eating working in the restaurant got hit with it because the wind blew it inside. It wasn't so bad in the kitchen, but one of the waitresses got it pretty bad, and they asked her if she could finish her shift and continued service as if nothing happened. Story 20, after leaving school, I had an evening job at the cinema, and I was punched by a patron, was still then expected to carry on for another 4 hours despite my bleeding everywhere. Let's just say I didn't come in for another shift after that. Story 21, I work at a restaurant. One day our oven broke, so we couldn't cook any food. The manager made us stay open as we could still sell salad without the cooked elements, drinks, and cheesecake. Total sales for the day were $4.59. That was the cheesecake the manager bought for himself. Story 22, working in a retail location for a large cell phone carrier. The expectations were always way out of hand. One experience jumps out of my memory. We were the only store in about a 30-mile radius, so we were slammed. All day, every day, it was spring, the rainy season for us, and we got a particularly nasty storm. Roads were flooded all over town. Dumpsters were floating down streets. Tornadoes were spotted 10 miles away. Half of our staff couldn't even physically make it to the store because of the roadways, and they received attendance demerits. I was the manager on duty, calling my area manager to beg to let me close the store while buckets of rain pelted the windows, lightning crashed, and power flickered. He said it wasn't warranted. He lived about 50 miles away. I'm sure he thought I was exaggerating. My staff were having panic attack from the storm. People were in line for hours and pissed we were short-staffed. Ride it out or risk getting fired. Yeah, I left that job. Story 23, I had one of my worst migraines ever and was sobbing and vomiting. I was working my shift at Sonic at the time, and the manager said it was too busy for me to go. Story 24, when I used to work for Verizon, I was asked to work at a new store we had acquired as a sort of interim manager in order to get things set up and new people trained in. The person that was hired to be the permanent store manager was an odd individual. He was usually pretty cool when there were no customers in the store. When there were, however, he would struggle with getting customers' phones set up understandable, since he's new, so I would offer help. After the customers left, he would call a store meeting. Don't help me unless I ask for it. Okay, sounds good. Next day, the inverse would happen. Head struggle, get frustrated, eventually begrudgingly ask for my help. Customers leave, and we have another store meeting. If it looks like I'm struggling, come and help. Fine, repeat a few more times. Eventually one day, I come into the store, and he starts laying into me about how I act like I own the Placeum better than everyone else and how I intimidate the other employees, which was hilarious. We got into a shouting match first, and only time I have ever done this with someone that wasn't my younger brother, LOL, and it got to the point that my choices were either I decide to disengage and leave the store, or it's going to escalate into fisticuffs. I left and went to the gas station across the street to call my boss. I explained what happened and that I wasn't going back in there, at least not that day. He gave me a spiel about how disappointed he was, but begrudgingly accepted the guy would be fired a couple weeks later for not being a good fit. Like, no. Story 25, was an exterminator for a while, and one of the places I did preventative treatments, spraying and treating before there was a problem, was an old seedy motel. I used to go to the office and tell them I was there and walk to each room, maybe 20 to 25 rooms, long story short. Found a dead guy. Person didn't answer their door, so I thought it was unoccupied. So I went in and called my boss, told him, and he said, "What time's your next appointment?" I laughed and went home. Story 26, I had been in an accident where I was hit by a van when on my bike. I was on my way to the hospital and shot a quick text to my immediate boss to let him know that I might not be in the next day. As I didn't know what the damage was and how long I may be, he told me to take the day off to be sure I recovered properly. The next day, his boss called me and asked me where the eye was. I told him I'd been hit by a van, and he said, and I didn't work there much longer after that. Story 27, somewhat related, but I got fired from my job at Borders because the guy covering for me while I was on vacation got fired. I was enjoying some time with my girlfriend and her family at their timeshare in Hilton Head when I got a text from another cashier. She was the girlfriend of the guy covering for me and told me that I should call the store because Jose got fired, and I guess they were expecting me to come in and work my shifts. I called in, and they were like, "Yeah, you've been terminated." It was such bullshit, but I was going to quit when I got back anyway because I was sick of the terrible management there, so I guess they saved me the trouble. Story 28, I slammed my head on a forklift and suffered a concussion while working a summer job in high school. My boss sent me to urgent care to get stitched up, but once that was done, he expected me to come back to work and finish the day. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now I realize that he was serious. Story 29, my first proper job was part-time behind the bar in a football stadium for American soccer, and the catering company running the show was notoriously shite. One shift, there was an older gen at the back of the queue who just collapsed. The stadium marshals came running, started CPR, got a defibrillator out, the whole works. It looked pretty serious and was all happening less than 15 feet from where I was standing. People were still trying to queue up for their pints around the entire scene, staring and just generally getting in the way. Then one of the marshals collared our manager and told him to close the bar, so people would go elsewhere and they could do their first aid without having to shout at people to back off. His response, "We can't do that. If we close now, that's half this section's takings for the day, and besides, I don't have the authority to close this bar. You need to talk to the boss." Us bartenders were baffled as our bar slowly filled with our company's upper management and the stadium security people who were all having a blazing row, while there was a guy having a literal heart attack on the floor in front of us, surrounded by the stadium's first aiders. All while footy fans were stepping over them, trying to get to the bar before the match started. This was also the first time I'd ever seen someone get actual CPR done on them. It's nothing like on TV, which was mildly distressing as a 17-year-old from a tiny boring village, but hey, Eventually, one of the more experienced bartenders just hit the switch for the shutters while the managers argued. Bar closed, paramedics arrived, and took the man off in an ambulance. I don't know what happened to him, but we didn't see 3 of our managers again after that. We assumed they were let go. Story 30, we had a really bad gas leak at our restaurant once and had to wait outside until the proper authorities could come and fix it. My boss rolls up and yells, "Why are you outside? We need to be making money. Sir, if we light up the grills, we light up the whole restaurant." He didn't care and insisted that we go back in anyway. We didn't, LOL. Story 31, they flew me to another country for a business conference and were nice enough to book me a nice 5 a.m. ticket home. This afforded me 0 sleep since the happy hours raged late into the night, and the airport was an hour train ride away. I arrived home at 2 p.m., running on 4 hours of sleep in the past 72 hours. And when my face hit the pillow, my boss at the time called, asked, "Where are you?" I firmly yet politely said I was working from home. When he said they need more to notice, I hung up, called his boss, and explained the situation. They said I could take the day off and come in late the following day. Story 32, not an employer, but as 911 was unfolding, my high school teacher turned off the TV and told us there are more important things than what's on TV, like trigonometry. Story 33, I had to organize a set of folders by color, but my problem is I'm colorblind, so I told him, "Yo, I'm colorblind." He thought it was me trying to get out of work and threatened to fire me. Story 34, I was doing a construction job building houses. As I was walking past to unload a supply truck, one of the slanted ceiling tiles came loose slide off the top and hit me in the chest, breaking 3 ribs and cracked sternum. I got a text the next day from my boss saying, "Heard about the accident. You coming in?" When I informed him I will not and told him of my injuries, he replied, "Oh yeah, I was told that. You're still coming in though, right? I need an extra man to mix concrete and clean up trash. Just light stuff like I could bend down right now." So I again told him, no, even if I could have, I was still doped up from the pain meds they'd given me at the hospital. The final text was right. About 2 hours later, I got a call from his wife apologizing and telling me to rest as long as is required, and her husband will just have to get off his fat and do his own work for a change. I found out he wanted me to work, so he wouldn't have to, and all those I have a client meetings and meeting with a supplier today, excuses were him just not wanting to come in so he could stay home and play video games. Story 35, just a few weeks ago, a toilet on the floor above our 3 offices branch of a law firm got stopped up, then unclogged and flooded our offices with, it affected the 2 lawyers, not me legal assistant. Their desks and papers were soaked, carpets soaked, files soaked. HQ brought us some fans to dry the carpet. The office smelled like a huge BM. We still had clients coming in. No one was ever sent out to clean or remediate anything hazardous mold. Our office is cleaned every 2 weeks, and the cleaners didn't come last Friday, which would have been 2 weeks since the leak. There's 2 cases of confirmed coronavirus in my county. Turns out they're in my office. It's especially wild because telework is pretty normal here. Why can't I just work from home for a couple weeks? Story 36, I work in an office building in a part of town that has a high population of homeless people. Most of them keep their distance from the property, but some come inside and like to stir up. So one day, a homeless man walked into our reception area and started messing around with our receptionist. My desk, if fairly close to where this transpired. So I heard everything. A lot went down, and we ended up having to call the police. The cop walked in and started talking to the homeless man. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, the officer screams he's got a gun. So loud that everyone in the building here, it's only 2 stories. My heart literally collapsed into my stomach. I was 17 at the time and working at a makeshift and tiny desk at the very end of a narrow hallway. My desk was so small that I, female, 53, 115 pounds, couldn't fit under my desk all the way. I found out that it was a false alarm as I was trying to stuff myself under my desk. I had to go back to work for another 12 hours after the officer escorted the man out. Wasn't fun. Story 37, we had temporary offices in an old college dorm that had been declared unfit for students because it had no air conditioning and there was no airflow in the place, even with the windows open, plus my window was directly over the air vent for the college dining hall. So I couldn't open it anyway. We were supposed to be out by the summer. Of course, that didn't happen. When summer came around, the temps in the office were 85 to 90 degrees with about 100 humidity and dead air. How bad was it? 2 of my coworkers had heart attacks and ended up taking early retirement. Story 38, working on a film, said a few years ago, one of our Teamsters crossed the street without looking and was nailed by a car going 30 miles per hour. I was talking to someone outside set and saw the whole thing happen. The guy went end over end, probably 15 to 20 feet in the air, and landed hard on his mangled legs, and luckily not his head. Everything had to stop for an hour or so while our medic worked on him, and we waited for an ambulance. No sooner than the ambulance pulled away, the producers are yelling at everyone to get back to work. The Teamster lived but broke both femurs, and most of the crew was pretty shell-shocked by the incident. It was especially demoralizing when we found out the only reason he crossed the street at all was to get a cup of ice for the very demanding star. Story 39. I worked for a pizza chain years ago while I was at university. One afternoon, I was prepping ingredients for that night and managed to slice the tip of one of my fingers off. I was working alone, so I had to call my GF to come and drive me to our... On the way, I called my manager to let them know what had happened, and the first thing they asked was, "Can you still come in and work tonight?" Story 40. Panic asthma attack. Paramedics were called. I was hooked up to blood pressure monitors and given albuterol via mask in the warehouse of my work. Blood oxygen level was near 80. I refused to go with them to the hospital. I live in the U.S. and not about to step foot into an ambulance if I'm still conscious. They even asked my boss to leave the warehouse, thinking I was refusing because of being worried about work reprimands. So they left, but encouraged me to go to the hospital if it happened again that day. But because I didn't go to the hospital, my boss told me to take my 15-minute break to collect myself, and then I had to finish the last 12 hours of work as word got around that the ambulance parked out front was because of me. Good OL retail jobs. Story 41. My boss forgot to release the pressure in a water sprinkler system before he told me to replace several elements. While 30 feet up in a scissor lift, I was blasted with a few hundred gallons of dark black water full of microbiologically induced corrosion. Knocked on my, could have fallen out and got soaked through. Got chewed out for flooding the shop floor and still had to finish the day. Story 42. I was 9 months pregnant and having contractions. My GM started working my shifts with me just in case I went into labor. Though I had a planned C-section, he was a good boss. My GM had gone to the store for cigarettes when my contractions started, and I was pushing through them because I knew they were Braxton Hicks. He comes back and sees this, sends me on maternity leave then, and there, okay, cool. I worked 6 to 10 that day. It was slow. So my GM left. He was working 7 days a week to shadow me. In an hour or so, later the afternoon manager, 6P, called me and told me if I was scheduled until 2, I needed to return until 2. I said I'm on maternity leave, and she said it doesn't say so here, so you need to come in, and I said call GM, and hung up. Story 43. Last year, I got all 4 wisdom teeth taken out at once, was still rostered on to work the day after, even with weeks of notice given, end up having to call in sick with them reluctantly accepting. Story 44 doesn't exactly answer the question, but somewhat on the same topic. It was a Friday at like 9 o'clock a.m., and suddenly the power in the factory died. We all sat around for about an hour until our maintenance crew came back and said a squirrel had jumped on the transformer, and we wouldn't get our power back until 2:30 p.m. God bless that squirrel. Story 45. 9 to 11. I was managing a small team. We were all shocked and gathered around computers, trying to understand what happened. The owner called me in his office and told me to tell everyone to get back to work. He said there was nothing we could do, and we were wasting time and money. Nope. Story 46. I was in the hospital with chest pain, thinking I was about to have a heart attack. 7 hours later, am leaving and call my work since I hadn't been able to sleep for the past 4 hours. I still had to come in. Story 47. Not necessarily crazy, but a power outage at a bank. Until you work at one, people don't realize just how dependent our finance industry is on technology. It isn't as simple as writing down numbers in bank logs anymore, lol. Story 48. When I was living out of state, I got word that my dad back home was dying. So I told the district manager of the restaurant I served that I needed to take a leave of absence for a few weeks to a month and go home immediately. This was in mid-June. Her immediate response was, I don't know if I can do that. We're already short-staffed for Father's Day. Story 49. Not my boss, but my bio teacher. I was a high school freshman in NYC in 514F at the time. That December, the MTA went on strike for 3 days, shutting down public transportation. I took a city bus to school on a half-hour bus ride across the borough that went over long parkways and lasted for over 5 miles. My parents didn't have a car, we couldn't afford cabs, and that meant the only way I could get to school was if I walked. But since I was still just a 14-year-old girl, my parents weren't going to let me walk across the Bronx over dimly lit parkways by myself for 5 miles before the sun came up just to get to school. They kept me home for the 3 days of the strike. The strike ends, and I get back to school. My bio teacher proceeds to chastise me in front of my whole class for missing 3 days of school. Yeah, sorry, not getting kidnapped or hit by a car or murdered, just so you can do a bad job teaching us about cell structures. Story 50. I was working at a fast food place, and the pipeline going to the sewer broke, making water and sewage back up through the floor drains. I called the store manager to tell him we needed to close. He said just keep the water from going into the dining area. I told him it was already out there having come up through the drains in the bathrooms. He let us close the doors, but made us keep the drive-through open. So we're standing in sewage making food for people driving through. Story 51. I used to work as a server at a fine dining restaurant in the Bay Area. At the time, I wasn't the most mature adult Reed Stoner and regularly made up excuses for why I couldn't come into work. After a while, my boss got pretty sick of it and made threats to fire me if I called in again. Well, one day, I was helping a friend harvest wine grapes from their hobby vineyard before my shift. About 2 hours before my shift was scheduled to start, I was getting ready to go home to get cleaned up, and I stumbled on an irritated skunk, and it sprayed me right in the face. I tried calling my boss and telling her what happened, but she wasn't buying it and told me if I don't come in ID, be fired. So I went in smelling like the worst kind of dog. It took about 2 seconds of being in her presence before she excused me from work. Story 52. I was working fast food, mostly cut off the tip of my thumb. Boss said just bite it off and put a Band-Aid on it. I told him that if he bit the top off his thumb, I'd bite the tip off mine. Story 53. One time a pipe leading to the sewage tank burst through a wall that I was standing next to. I tried to clean it up and move product out of the way until someone ran in screaming that it was sewage. When I asked to go home, they said I was the only closer and I had to finish my shift. Needless to say, but I quit immediately. But that was the first and hopefully last time I'll be covered in human. Story 54. During the fall, the area where I live was having massive fires. When I was almost to my work, I saw was smoke coming from this hill right by it, and one of those water-carrying helicopters going towards it. Work was still in. Funnily enough, even though the sky was red and it smelled like battery acid, our school tried to stay open until they were legally required let us leave, not even halfway into the day, just a regular day in California. Story 55. Not my story, but my best friend called me freaking out one night. I could barely understand what she was saying, but finally figured out that one of the employees in her department died at the department store she worked at that morning while helping a customer right in front of her. And they made her stay to close the store and made her tell the rest of her employees that she was just on the hospital and they didn't have an update yet. Story 56. Literal next-door neighbor lit his kitchen on fire on purpose, then barricaded himself and his daughter in the bathroom. The air vents were shared. My cats were breathing in smoke, and I had to leave to get them out. They didn't believe me when I left and said I couldn't come back the rest of my shift until someone loudly mentioned seeing me on the news while outside the building. Story 57. I found out my stepbrother passed away unexpectedly during my lunch break. I was expected to continue my shift when I physically couldn't because I couldn't stop crying. I was told that I could just come in early the following day to get my work done. I had the following day off because I was leaving for my honeymoon. So after crying all night, I had to go into work at 5 a.m., the earliest you could start to finish 3 hours of work to rush to try and not miss my international flight. There's no reason someone else couldn't have done it, but it is what it is. Story 58. Where I live, the companies around here will all tell you the same thing. They can fire you at any time for any or no reason at all. You're in an employment at, well, I think that's what it's called, position, and they can let you go for whatever they feel like. I worked at a call center a few years ago, and when I started there, I had to go through this class that was 2 weeks long. It was around Christmas time, so we were excused to Christmas Day only. If you missed one day, you were fired, and you could reapply and get rehired, but you'd have to do the class all over again. One guy got into a car accident on Christmas Eve, and he flew through the windshield. He came to work with an eye patch and a scar across his whole face. He never even went to the hospital because he wanted to keep his job. They made him leave to go to the hospital because his eye looked infected, and they still fired him. Story 59. I literally passed out on the blacktop after pushing carts for 2.5 hours. Almost got run over by a car, threw up, got sunburned, and my heart rate skyrocketed to 163. My boss literally just gave me a Band-Aid and said, walk it off, I don't like them. Needless to say,